I'm Shelley Francis. I'm founder of Creative Courage Press and author of The Courage Way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Creative Courage Live. I'm here today with author Erin Lane. Her new book is called Someone Other Than a Mother, Flipping the Scripts on a Woman's Purpose and Making Meaning Beyond Motherhood. I would love to talk to you, Erin, today. Welcome. I'm so excited that we're doing this.
This is so fun. Thanks for having me.
So I would love to talk to you about your experience as an author through the lens of courage, because you're someone whose courage I admire. I think of you as an exemplar of being an authentic, courageous woman and writer and facilitator and leader of life. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, let's just jump in and say, how do you define creative courage for yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, it's three things. It's remembering what I want, which is always helpful. Setting out with curiosity, and then being really generous with the forgiveness when I fail. So I think of the creative process in those three movements, the sort of setting of intentions or remembering of desire, then moving out with curiosity to see, is that even what I want? Is this even the path I think I feel called to go down? I often don't know until I get started. I don't have crystalline clarity at the beginning of projects. Or even at the beginning of seasons of my life. And so I find that setting out with curiosity is really important for that. And then again, that heaps of forgiveness when I inevitably fail, or at least fail to do what I thought I was going to do. And one of my favorite quotes on that comes from another writer named Ann Patchett. And she says this: I can't write the book I want to write, but I can and I will write the book I am capable of writing. Again and again throughout the course of my life, I will forgive myself. And I think you can't make art, you can't live life without that self-forgiveness, or else you just would never take the risks that make creative courage possible.
That's so true. I mean, the risk to put yourself out there, the risk to try and fail and to forgive yourself and go on to the next revision, I guess.
Right. Right. So much writing and rewriting.
So when did you first realize you wanted to be an author, and what kind of courage did you need to become an author?
Well, I began making books, I think in the second or third grade. My family had this old, although it was probably new to them, Macintosh computer in the basement that we all fought over, who got to use it when. And I remember really early on finding the Microsoft Publisher program and being ooh, here's a template for not only how I could write a book, but here's how I could make it pretty. Because I always think when I'm writing in terms of not just the content, but the container. And actually, I'm a very firm believer in the idea that containers create content. I know some people work in reverse, that whatever the content is informs the container, but I've always done the opposite. I've always imagined, what does this book look like and where is it on the shelf? And so I remember my very first book was a fiction book, which is hilarious. I don't even read that much fiction anymore. I know that's taboo to say, but I'm a huge nonfiction geek. But my very first book was called The Remote Control. And it was about a young girl who found out that she could see a VHS of her life. I think they've made movies or versions of this since then. And maybe I already had seen something that gave me the idea for this, but she could fast forward or rewind to sort of see her life from a distance. But of course, she gets to the end and all of a sudden it goes blank. And she was like, what happened? And so, of course, there was a sequel and maybe even a third. But I remember that that's when I just really started delighting in not just writing books, but making books. The whole process was fascinating to me. And I think the kind of courage you need to sort of get lost in your own world is the courage to like be in love with yourself. I think that sounds really audacious maybe to some people, or arrogant, but I think from a very early age, I was enamored with the worlds that existed within me. And I've had to, as I've matured, also become enamored with the worlds that exist outside of myself. I think that's a part of growing up. But early on, I think it's this like very audacious love for yourself, and how you see the world and the worlds that you can bring forth with your own words. And that felt pretty magical, and probably not all that courageous when I began. But as I've gotten older, it feels very courageous to be in love with yourself and in love with the worlds that exist within you.
That feels like a sense of true identity, and voice and agency too, to feel like the words that you can imagine and the worlds you can imagine are worth bringing into the world.
Yes, right. Like there was a sense early on that I was a mediator of sorts. And I think writers and creatives are, right. There's a world that exists in their imagination, or for spiritual writers like myself, sometimes we feel like there's an invisible spiritual world that like doesn't see the light of day in the way that we know it to be true within ourselves or in our communities or even in our sacred traditions and texts. I think a lot of writing is trusting, as you said, that the world is worth birthing, and that if not you, then who?
One of the lines that I loved that kept coming up in your book was something your husband told you is, Erin, nobody is thinking about this stuff as much as you.
Yes.
And so when did you realize that you wanted to write this book? And that seems paired with, when did you realize you did not want to be a mother?
Right.
And
yeah.
And yet I'll just squeeze in there for people who don't know yet that you are a parent today of 3 girls who came to you through foster parenting first. So you are a mother, but you're also someone other than a mother yourself. So you've been thinking about this a while.
I have. And I think all good stories have an inciting incident. Like everything's going along somewhat predictably until all of a sudden something happens that is irritating or agonizing, or world changing, or just even like an aha moment. It doesn't have to be something grand, but it becomes this moment that something sticks. And if you start watching movies or reading novels, right, like you'll see that in every good story, there's some kind of inciting incident. And in my own life, there have been many, right? All of us have many of those. If we were going to set out to tell a certain story about our lives or that has come to us through our imagination. But this particular story, the inciting incident, was after we adopted unexpectedly 3 girls from the foster system in Durham County. Before that, I had been happily child-free with my husband for about 10 years. After these huge kind of life-changing shifts happened, the inciting incident was how excited everyone was about my life suddenly. And it wasn't everyone, I'm making broad brushstrokes, but I felt like all of a sudden there was an interest in my life, there was a relatability to my life, and there was a celebration of my life that there had never been in that kind of flood force before becoming a parent. And it was that experience of people saying thank you, of people bringing me casseroles, of people sending gifts and cards. And again, it was amazing. Like my community's love and support was amazing. And I was so irritated that it hadn't been there before I did something with my life that was recognizably good. or recognizably praised or recognizably traditional, even though we became parents in pretty untraditional fashion. So that's what started. And I remember writing the preface, and I believe it was the end of 2018. The adoption had become final in 2017. I decided to take a sabbatical, both from paid work, but also as a way of just sort of like letting my soul catch up to the speed of my own life, because so much had changed. And I am not independently wealthy. So I took money out of retirement to sort of pay myself a $12,000 salary for that year. So I lived off $1,000 a month with my husband's salary. Of course, he kept working. And I took a year off and wrote nothing of consequence until the very end. And then this story of why it was that people were so excited about my life suddenly, how I was making sense of an identity shift that didn't feel like a huge deal. The day-to-day of my life changed greatly, but like who I was felt pretty solid and familiar. And yet everyone else was speaking to me and talking to me as if I had become a different person now that I was a mother. And so just making sense of like, am I in denial? Are they right? Like, what are these messages I'm getting? And are there other women who have been thinking about this? And so the book ended up being kind of like a memoir manifesto, a memoir about my own journey to make peace with my story, but how I used other women's stories in my life who were going off script and making meaning beyond the kind of the traditional shape of motherhood. What courage I took from them.
Say more about the manifesto part. That is a statement of courage in itself, to say something, make a manifesto.
Yeah. So again, back to the container idea, as I thought about what would be the container for this story, because a lot of folks tell you in publishing that memoirs are hard. They're hard to write and hard to sell. And one of the hardest things about writing a memoir is turning the me into a we. Some people are really good at it, and some people are really good at telling their own story, but not necessarily helping the reader connect to like what the universal story is. And so I knew that if I wanted to write this particular book, it couldn't just be my story, or else it would probably read like a pretty straight foster to adopt narrative, which there are a lot of those. And I feel like that story has been told. And again, every story's been told, right? None of us are coming up with like completely original ideas. But that wasn't the story I was most interested in. I was most interested in these messages women were getting about motherhood, whether they became mothers or not. And so the shape of the book ended up eventually being that every chapter is a crappy script that women have been given about motherhood. So something that people say to women, like your biological clock is ticking, or parenting is the toughest job in the world, or it'll be different with your own. And really investigating that script alongside my own story, alongside other women's stories, and then also trying to offer a more generous rewrite of like, what can we say about a woman's calling that's bigger and wider and more generous than all her body wants to do is reproduce. And so that became the manifesto part, that every chapter is this script and this rewrite. And I think of the rewrites as the manifesto, the rewrites as like, actually, you've heard it said this, but I'm suggesting to you that it's more like that. And just wanting people to also be invited into investigating the scripts they've inherited, because we don't all inherit the same scripts. I live in a particular body, in a particular location, in a particular race, in a particular gender presentation. Like all of that shapes the scripts I've inherited, but we've all inherited them in some form or fashion, the life scripts that tell us like what's a good way to live and how we can investigate those, and set out to like write our own story within some bigger stories.
So what was the most challenging aspect of writing this book on this topic, and what gave you the courage to take it on?
Well, my editor could tell you that my number one challenge was I had too much to say and I didn't know what was the best way to say it. And we kept talking about the simplicity on the other side of complexity, because I felt like this was a really complex story. And honestly, like the stories I'm most interested in are complex stories. And yet I think it's real empathy for your reader when you can figure out how to take some complexity and try to get to the simplicity on the other side of it so that there's not so much noise the reader has to sit through to know what it is that, you really want them to get from the heart of the matter. What's the invitation? What's the call in their own life? So simply the fact that I was trying to weave my own story with other women's stories who I'd interviewed for the book. I interviewed about 20 women who are someone other than a mother in some form or fashion. And then a lot of theological research. My own tradition is Catholicism, and there are a lot of messages in Catholicism about what a woman's purpose is, the high good of biological procreation. And yet there are a lot of messages too about the astonishing good life you can live when you devote yourself to a spiritual family. So trying to make sense of those on top of the sociological research. So there were a lot of threads about how do these messages, these popular cultural messages, how have they been conflated with religion and specifically American Christianity? And how do these particular stories, my own included, offer a different imagination for what a good life looks like? So yeah, the hardest part was just the sheer amount of material and the sensitivity of it too. I think I have a lot of fear about getting other people's stories wrong, or not doing them justice, or co-opting them or colonizing them. Like those are things that I probably failed in small and large ways throughout the process. And then that's again where the the learning and the self-forgiveness, and also the owning up to those mistakes as I see and find them. So the courage, I mean, I think the courage is just, again, to set out imperfectly. Like friends have been texting me about like, how are you feeling? The book's about to come out. And I've been writing back, I am 100% behind the concept and 67% behind the execution. And most days I can live with that ratio.
Well, I want to take just like a side tour then about the execution of the book launch. And I saw you do something really courageous in the writing of your book, which was to take a sabbatical from social media. And that seems to buck the trends of all the author platform best practices and advice that we see. So why did you choose to do that? And do you have any regrets about it now that the book is coming out?
No regrets.
Great.
No regrets. I'm a part of a little writers group on Instagram. We call ourselves the Hype Squad. And we just try to be over the top celebratory about each other's posts. And when we can, comment profusely with emojis and enthusiasm. And pretty frequently within that group, maybe once a week, someone says, I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish that being on social media as frequently as I am weren't a part of being a public writer or a public person these days. So yes, there is this deep, persistent pressure that writers feel to, as my pastor, the Reverend Lisa Yaboa says, be a persona rather than a person. But I think a couple of things I've learned in the process. One, I didn't miss it at all. It was delightful. It was restorative. I went off officially, I think in June 2020, not just to focus on writing the book, but also because that was sort of the time around when like the racial reawakening was happening in our country after George Floyd's murder. And I was learning so much about the public voice of white people and when it was necessary and when it wasn't. And I just felt like rather than continuing to center myself and my own work, it was a really good season to be a listener of other people's, especially people of color's work and their voices. And then again, focus on my own creative process by going inward. And as you know, as Parker Palmer says, getting the news from within, in addition to getting it from other trustworthy sources. So it was a delightful year. And I've really enjoyed popping back on after I finished the manuscript and turned it back in. It's been really fun to connect with people and share ideas again. So I'm curious about what my ongoing relationship with it will be. Yeah, I'm really curious about that. So I'm having fun, but I could totally see myself hopping off again when I'm ready to start my next project. So I highly encourage people, if they are thinking about it or feeling the pressure for whatever reason to be on it, that, yeah, try taking a break, see what opens up within you, see what feelings perhaps have been numbed by the incessant scrolling or posting or wondering after a big event happens, like, what can I say about it? There's just this really false sense of urgency, I think, especially amongst white people, to offer their voice on matters, to be public about our thoughts and to share them quickly and pithily. And I think it's a real healing, profoundly anti-racist thing to question that impulse and to do your own inner work with your local community before trying to impress like an audience of infinity.
That's so true. And it feels like you're also speaking to this concept of spaciousness for creativity, that by being out of the public eye and just focusing internally on your own work, whatever that is, I mean, the inner work, but also the work of writing and the work of having the rest of your whole life going on, that sometimes that's that social media piece that puts so much more pressure than is conducive to our creativity.
Yeah. And it's just so noisy, you know, like, again, going back to the like falling in love with like the world within me. That world is pretty loud. Like that world is pretty robust. And so, yeah, just it's so easy for me to get lost. So easy for me to lose that thread that I hang on to, as William Stafford said in his poem. So I think, yes, it's noisy out there. And our attention spans are not what they used to be. And there's a real practice for me in quieting whatever noise I can to be a faithful listener to the noise within.
So this is a perfect segue into like the next collection of questions I wanted to ask you. I call these the courage quintessentials because I wanted to land on something you could count on one hand. So what are the key ingredients to courage? And what I learned in writing The Courage Way, or what I saw in all the leaders that I interviewed for that, was that it came down to like 3 big ideas and 2 key practices. So true self, who am I as a writer? As an author, what's my message? Trust, like how do I trust in who I am, but how do I trust in other people? And how do I trust in like the bigger vision overall or life overall? And community. And community, courage needs community no matter what. I mean, I think that's just such a key. And then 2 practices were paradox and holding the tensions of what seem like opposites, and then reflection. Reflecting on all of those things seemed to be like a rubric for how to check in with yourself as a leader or an author or a writer. So like that's the overview I wanted to give, but I would love to talk about your creative courage through those lenses, just one at a time, if you'd like. And you've mentioned a lot of that already, so I feel like you're just an exemplar of courage in those ways. So tell me about how you approach being true to yourself as an author, true self, and What does that look like?
Because I have worlds of words within me, I've always struggled to listen for the voice of true self, because sometimes I think there are true selves. I think there are like multiple facets of me, and there are multiple voices I could speak from that are true. And so I am very curious. I'm very curious about true self versus true selves. Um, and so this book, writing this book, was really difficult because there were so many things I could say, but there were also so many voices that I could speak with that felt equally authentic. Um, and I mean, just to be honest with you, because it was written during a pandemic when I feel like all of our world shrank, and there wasn't a lot of outside inspiration, there were times where it felt like only listening to the noise within, only listening for the voice of true self, was making me feel incredibly lost, and without perspective. And so what I did was I found books that were kind of my exemplar creative courage books. And I would literally put them out on my desk, and I would open a paragraph, like open a random page, look at a paragraph and say, okay, she started her sentence in this way. I could start my sentence with a similar structure. And of course, the content is totally different, but I needed to read other things, other people's true self voices that touched my own, to continually like stay in the sound of my genuine, to use another favorite creative courage exemplar, Howard Thurman's phrase. I had to constantly be reminded of that. And I think the thing I come back to over and over again is that like my true self, if she had like a motto, it would be words made fresh. And so anytime I'd write a sentence that I'm like, no, that's what you think you're supposed to say, I erase it and try to write something truer. Or anytime I'd write a sentence and I'd notice I was getting in like this really stuffy academic voice, I was like, can you say it less wooden? Can you say it with less jargon? And so I think that's really like my vibe as a writer, is to always ask myself, is this the truest thing I could say? And is this like the freshest way I can say it? And it doesn't have to be fresh to anyone else but me. Like, I just need to say it in a way that feels like I actually would tell a friend this particular thing, rather than kind of puffing up a sense of literary ego or something to that effect that would obscure kind of the gut, the heart of what I'm trying to say. So I guess that's the complicated answer, is that I do feel like being true to my true self requires listening within, but it also required a lot of help from other people to remember what that sounds like. And it's kind of one of those things that I don't always know how to describe it until I hear it. And then I'm like, yeah, like that's the kind of way I want to write. Yeah, that's the kind of way I want to live.
That makes sense, because it also feels like part of true self is recognizing your limits, or when you're not being authentic, or when that voice doesn't really, like, it's too academic or something. So being self-aware about that. And it also ties into trust. So trusting, what did you have to trust? What and who did you need to trust in this process?
Right. Well, in addition to my own voice, because that was difficult and is difficult for writers who want to make a living writing, because there's the book you want to write, and then there's the book that sells. And those aren't always the same book at the beginning. And so I remember very early on in this process, I went to a writing workshop and took 50 pages of this manuscript to workshop, and came away with feedback that like people weren't bored, but they were confused That's what I left with. We're not bored, but we're confused. And I remember asking the professor, well, I guess like I need to go back and work on the proposal again and pitch it to agents again. And she was like, I actually think you just need to like write 50 more pages, and then see what you have, before trying to package it for someone else's pleasure, or purchase. So there was that initial stage where, right, there were too many cooks in the kitchen, and I had to really see like, what do I have? What is actually the book I want to write? And then there was the stage where I had to trust an agent. I actually had an agent initially who was wonderful and beautiful, and I wanted to be her best friend. And she tried to pitch the book, and we got one offer. And I realized, oh, I don't think that's the book I actually want to write. So I took a step back. We parted ways. I didn't end up signing with that particular editor and publisher. And then I found another agent who was excited about the idea, but was like, I think we need to like make it a little bit more in this direction. It needs to be punchier. It needs to have a more defined audience. And so learning to trust that, yes, I knew what I wanted to write, but I also wanted to make money and I wanted to make a living. And this is what I wanted to do, not to compromise the voice of my true self, but to, again, develop empathy for the reader and empathy for the market. And I know that might sound like a little too close to capitalist comfort for some people, but I think it's any artist has to think about that tension between the art you want to make and the art that can make a living, and trying to find the like happy Venn diagram of the two, where you're making art you're proud of and you can also make something of a living is pretty special, but takes trusting other people like agents, like publishers, like editors, to tell you the truth about what people are ready to hear and how they're used to hearing it, and what edges you can push and what edges are just not time for yet.
Yeah. I remember working on a book with a friend early on about healthy sexuality for teens. And I was like, oh, people are not ready for that conversation. So finding the right title for the book and the right venue for that book was a challenge for sure. So community would be the third one. Where did community give you courage, and how did you seek out community for this project specifically?
Yeah, the community of this book, I think, is the women's stories that were featured in it. Again, I interviewed about 20 women who were redefining a life well lived or redefining motherhood. So I called them, these are primarily people who are childless, child-free, or making unlikely families. And they, I mean, if there's like any takeaway, I mean, I resist takeaways in life and in general, but if there's any takeaway in this book, I hope it inspires other people, whatever your parenting status in life, to sit at the feet of the childless and child-free and unlikely families, because I think so often they are viewed in our culture as like option B to the good life, or option B to growing up, or option B to maturity. When in fact, I think there are, for those healthy souls amongst that group, there are so many beautiful things they have to offer. And I don't want to romanticize them. They're still like fully human being with flaws and failures. But their wisdom, I think, is so underappreciated, like the wisdom of margin, the wisdom of limits, the wisdom of belonging to yourself, the wisdom of making kinship in improbable ways, the wisdom of loving your body, but not feeling like you're, I guess, that your like you're not letting your biology be destiny, right? That you are loving your body, you're being in your body. But you also realize that there are things, important things about your life and call that aren't limited to how you show up in the world in this particular way. So that community was everything to me. And when I lost my way repeatedly, even after I finished the book, I was just like mortified by all of the things I didn't get to say, or chose not to say, or chose to leave out, or chose to put in. And my friend Janelle, who I dedicated the book to, I called her crying. And she had just read kind of the near finished version. And she just said, "Oh, Erin, it's a 10 out of 10. It's a 10 out of 10." And I don't presume everyone will feel that way, but I think that's what I will keep coming back to as people start to respond and give feedback to the book itself, is that I wrote it for Janelle, and Janelle said it was a 10 out of 10. So like, if that's the measure of faithfulness, if that's the measure of effectiveness, then that is what I want to keep coming back to. So it's really the community of women whose stories are featured that just really helped me make peace with my own story, and are just some of the most fun, intentional, inspired, brilliant people I've ever sat at the feet of.
It was so great to see all of those stories woven in with your own. I mean, it does make it such a richer book, like seeing the elephant from all angles by seeing so many different stories represented.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. So what were some of the paradoxes that you feel like you had to practice or name, the tensions? I mean, there's so many, but just to lift up a few of what tensions felt like they were pulling on you and how you held them.
Yeah. I mean, I think two of the biggest tensions were, one, what you just named, the tension between my story and other women's stories. Getting that balance right, and right is, who knows what right is. As I say in the book, right is a rare and rigid thing. But as I tried to get that tension, that balance, to a place that felt good in the book, gosh, it was difficult. And I think that was where, again, I sent the book out in early forms to lots of different people. And to be honest, I am in love, as you have heard, with all of the women in the book. So I wanted to put like lots of their stories, long stories with little of my own. And really early on, the consistent feedback I got is, yeah, but we are buying this book, we are reading the story because we want your perspective on their stories. And so I think that was the challenge, that was the tension, is how do we listen deeply and share deeply from our own story, while also leaving space for other people's stories. And yeah, I wish there were more stories of other people in the book, but I have been slowly sharing bits of the interviews that didn't end up in the book on my newsletter. It's on Substack if you want to check it out. It's called Good for You, where we celebrate the less shiny bits of a life well lived. And I've been sharing those parts that I kind of regretting aren't in the book, or there wasn't space for it, or it didn't make narrative sense. So that's one way in which I've made peace with that tension, is that like not everything has to be in this book. I don't have to do it all at once in the same medium at the same time. And then the other paradox I feel like I held throughout was how, again, can I write about my specific location as an American Christian, white, cisgender, able-bodied woman, and not presume that my story is a stand-in for other people's faith, and race and gender, and sexual orientation, and all of those things that are really important for how we show up in the world and the kinds of stories we tell and are told about us. Yeah. So again, I think there were some actual creative craft level choices I had to make about how much to share of my theological knowledge. There are some robust footnotes where I ended up putting a lot of the theological information in case people wanted to just keep skipping over it. You will not offend me if that is what you do. But trying to make it clear that this is like one way in which I make meaning and other people make meaning. But again, the invitation is to consider whatever cosmic stories have shaped us. Have they shaped us well? Or have they shaped us at times into smaller versions of who we know ourselves to be?
Love that. And just, you said something a second ago about making meaning. And I think about the depth of the stories that you tell and the depth of thinking that you put into it. So it does feel so memorable. That requires reflection on the deeper meanings of life, what you're really seeing, what you're hearing in the stories. And I know from your training as a Courage Renewal facilitator that, that's a skill to develop a sense of reflection. So how did your training as a facilitator actually help you in the book writing process, or your skills with reflection?
That's a great question. Well, as you and I both know, poetry is really helpful for reflection and helping one to see something other than the obvious. I think that's an invitation I like to give to myself regularly. Is there a third way? Is there something beyond the black and white options I think I have in this particular story or this particular decision? Is there a third way? That I think poetry is really beautiful at bringing to light truths that aren't necessarily absolute or aren't necessarily expected, or are more gentle truths than the ones we sometimes gravitate to. So I think the reliance on poetry as a tool of reflection, as an invitation into reflection, was important throughout the process. I wish I could have put more poetry in the book, but anyone who's ever tried to write a book that has some poetry in it knows there are complicated rights issues with using poetry. But that was one thing I think my Courage Renewal training gave me. And then the other thing is curiosity. So the touchstone that I think most people love best, and I love best, is when the going gets rough, turn to wonder. So the sense of wonder throughout the process was really important for reflecting on what is the thing that I most want to say here, and then translating that into what am I most curious about when it comes to this topic or this person's story or my own story. And I don't think I answer a lot of questions in this book. But I'm certainly very curious about the questions. And I think that is something my agent said to me after I turned the book in, and, was fretting that it was just going to be a landmine of missed opportunities. And he said to me, Erin, it's not about whether you came to the right conclusions. It's about whether you asked good questions. Because your answers, if you did answer something in the book, are going to change over time. You're going to change over time. And you might write a totally different book in 10 years. And that's the risk of the particular medium of books, physical books. But I think that's also the invitation to all of us is it's not about getting the answers right all of the time, but are we asking questions worthy of our attention?
And you touch on that toward the end of the book too, is that it's the questions who we are and our making meaning of life that matters so much. I don't have the exact page pulled up, but that one felt like, oh, that should be an Instagram plate.
Well, you should make it one and share it.
I just might. Well, we're getting close to the end, and I wanted to ask you, you all authors need a courage to connect and engage with our readers as an author. I know you did this during some of your process, but are you going to offer retreats specifically based on your book? And who would be your ideal reader and attendee of conversations?
That's a good question. Of course, you're asking such good questions. That's why you're hosting this beautiful podcast. I do not have plans for retreats, but I have been scheming what I call like an event menu. And so if you go to my website, erinslane.com, there are like 3 different options that I have thought coming out of this pandemic, like I would be willing to show up in an actual physical or virtual location to do one of these things. And it's as simple as an author reading and Q&A, to a book talk or sermon, to what I call a someone other than a mother gathering. And so that last one is probably as close as it might get to feeling like a Courage and Renewal reflective retreat, where I really want to have conversations with people, and particularly women, but I joke, someone other than a mother means everyone, like everyone, man, woman, child, in between, gender fluid, is someone other than a mother, right? Like we are souls beyond the roles that we play. And I am just always fascinated with talking to people about how they know what they know about their purpose in life. And purpose is just such a huge, bewildering, big word that I think maybe has gotten a little too fraught. So I am really curious about having conversations about how people break that down into like, do I want to be a parent or not? Or I am a parent and I didn't exactly expect this. So how am I making sense of the work I feel called to do in the world? Whether that's paid or unpaid, whether that's out of the home or not. I'm just so curious and want to talk to other people about what has shaped their idea of what's possible and what's good in life, and what are they learning that supports that or doesn't support that. Gosh, it's like, that's the inciting incident, right? Is there something that doesn't support that? Is there something you're learning that actually goes against everything you thought? Like those are the juicy parts. And how is your experiencing teaching you a truer, kinder way to live in the world? So I think the short answer is no, I'm not offering any of those things just yet as we come out of the pandemic. But I'm really curious and looking forward to the conversations that will come as this book makes its way out into the world.
Well, I love all the questions you just posed for potential readers and people to think about in light with your book as the third thing to have those conversations around. So would you like to show us the cover of your book and tell us about how beautiful it is and how it got to be that container that you talked about and made it so pretty?
It's so beautiful and backwards to you all, but
no,
I love it. Oh, great. I love it so much. Yeah, everyone who goes to a bookshop knows how important covers are. And this cover had some iterations beforehand, but I am obsessed with these colors. I am obsessed with the pictures, the different silhouettes that are sort of popping out of the words to represent that this isn't just a me story, but a we story. And I'm just so excited by the people whose names are on the front and on the back, who were so generous enough to endorse the book. I'm just really excited for this particular thing to be out in the world. And when it arrived a couple weeks ago, I picked it up and I was like, oh, I could have written more. So it's not a gigantic book. It is a book that I hope people find easy to read, fun to read, and like it will start good, more generous conversations with you and your people wherever you are.
I loved reading it, and I was reading it online from an early copy, and loved having the highlighter tool. So I recommend people get their highlighter out to read.
Ooh. And there's an audiobook version, which I recorded, but I haven't heard yet. Which I think is what my husband's going to do. He's going to download the audio version because he's read the written version way too many times now. So if you're also an auditory person, please download the audiobook. I would love to know what you think.
Oh my goodness, that'd be a whole nother conversation, is just what's that process to read your own book aloud.
Yeah, it was wonderful and weird and wild.
That's so great. Well, Erin, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was really fun, and I'm so proud of you and so excited for you to have this book out in the world.
Oh, thanks, Shelley. You are a fine interviewer, and it was really fun talking to you.
Thanks. Well, tune in next time for our next conversation.